Dear brothers and sisters, today we have a very interesting guest, NickolayTroyan, our old parishioner, long time, not old, long time parishioner.
And old too.
How many years you are here?
Well, we arrived here first time in 1977. I was stationed in Germany, and the army sent me back here to assign me to the Pentagon. So I've been coming to this church basically since '77. Then for a short period, I think 2 years, I don't remember now, in 1980 to '82, I was assigned to San Francisco. I was an advisor to Reserve and National Guard units, and then got reassigned here again. In '82, we came back and have been here ever since.
42 years.
You could say that, yes.
What changes do you see in our church, in our parish, and in our parishioners between that time and now?
Well, from what I noticed when you talk about the church, first of all, Father Victor came as a brand new priest. I was already here, and we had, I believe he was Father Nickolay, a much older priest before, from whom Father Victor took over as the head priest for here. Then, of course, I've seen a lot of additions in new priests, starting with his son-in-law, Father Alexander. We had another.
Father Alexander Reznikov.
Yes, yes. Of course, he became a priest. I saw him first time when I think he was a deacon first here, and then the new deacons that we have, virtually everyone other than Father Leonid, who was here when we got here. He was already here, and then other than Father Alexander, of course, there's Father David, of course, recently arrived. He's new, and Father Damien became a priest, and in between there was another Father Victor, young Father Victor, you probably know who I'm talking about, was here, and then he kind of quit serving. So that's quite a change, and of course the deacons, Father Patrick, then I'm not sure what his name is, he serves with Father Leonid. He used to sing in our choir and then became a deacon. Trubitskoy, I think is his last name. Yeah, is that his name? Yeah, and so we have those new deacons, and then in terms of the flock, if we can call ourselves that, of course, a lot of people, more recent arrivals from Russia, Ukraine, that you know, I would say right now, just guessing, I would say at least 55–60% of our congregation are new arrivals. What to me are new. Many of them have been here 20 years, but for me, who's been here 60 years in the States, they're new arrivals. So they come to our church and, of course, fulfill the church. And the older people, well, like myself, I'm 81, was gradually going away to greener pastures of that.
You were born in China.
Yes.
And then you spent some time in Tubabao.
Yes.
And then you moved directly to the United States.
No,
yes?
Then I spent 4.5 years in Australia, close to Sydney, and while my mother and stepfather came to the United States because he had a cousin here in San Francisco, sponsored him, and then they sponsored my uncle, my aunt, my grandmother is still alive, and my grandfather died in Australia, and my cousin and her grandmother, and they sponsored us, and we came in 1954 to the States.
The question is that all of these countries are not Orthodox countries. China and Philippines, even not Christian countries. How was important for you, for your family, to keep Orthodox roots, and how it was possible to keep it?
Well, first of all, from my understanding of the Russian diaspora, whether they were, say, like my wife, she was born in Serbia, what today is Serbia, the former Yugoslavia. No matter where the Russians, I called it, escaped or ran to when the Bolshevik Revolution occurred and the whites lost, they ran to various places. One of the first things Russians always did, apparently, anywhere they went, they stuck together, of course, a lot of times not because they wanted to stay together, but because of the circumstances, because that way, as a group, they were listened to more, they could get jobs or whatever, help each other. But one of the first things they did is always build a church, whether it had been starting out in a single room of some barrack or home or wherever. And so the same thing in China happened. Now, mind you, there were, of course, already a church there because the Tsarist representatives, the ambassador and consulates, they always had a church and a priest with them. I think it's a part of the old Russian tradition. Maybe it's the same thing could be said whether the other countries that were, say, Catholic or Protestant, and no matter of the Christian religions. Probably the same thing can be said of the Jewish or the Muslim religions, because when those people moved, to them, this connection with the other world, so to speak, with the holy understanding. And of course our religion is very strong, and a lot depended on how we children were brought up by our parents, and they were very religious.
Do you remember how Orthodoxy came into your personal life?
Well, sure. My grandfather, from my mother's side, was a Russian naval officer. He fought in the Battle of Tsushima. In fact, he was a junior lieutenant. He graduated from the Imperial Naval Academy, Nakhimov Academy in St. Petersburg. And so when he became an ensign, what we call, or I'm trying to think the Russian term for the lowest ranking junior officer, Gardimarin, I guess, yeah. Well, during the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, he commanded the cannon on the front of Makarov, the ship, and so he around hit there. He was thrown against the bulwark. He got a contusion. He was a prisoner of war with the Japanese, and later on in Shanghai, in fact, the year I was born, 1938, he lost sight in both eyes. One eye fell out, the other didn't. But he was very religious, and so when I was born, I became his eyes. He would carry me around, and I'd tell him, go here or here when we walked out of the place we lived in, a house or that we were renting, or that he and my grandmother rented. And he would go to church. This was in Tsingtao, China, which is on the North China Sea. It's a resort area and that. And he would go to church. He always take me with him. And then, in fact, when I was 7 years old, Rodikayan, Shanghai, yeah, he came. He was the head metropolitan for that whole Chinese area, and he came visiting the church in Tsingtao. And my grandfather asked him, "Will you take my grandson as one of your older boys anytime you're here. Well, of course, he came only for 1-2 days and then he'd go back to Shanghai. But anytime he comes, so I used to hold his posse or his staff. And that's how I became an older boy. And actually, I continued being an older boy even when he wasn't there at that church in Tsingtao. Then when we were evacuated from Tsingtao, we went to Shanghai, and I joined the Priut, what they called. I wasn't in it because I had parents, I had a place to live, but I was friends with all the Priutiani, with all the orphanage children were there. In fact, my best man at our wedding in San Francisco, Kolya Masinkov, he was a Priutianian, and we were buddies there. And I went, and when we were evacuated from Shanghai, my family, and me included, we were evacuated at the same time as the Tikhonozadonsky orphanage was evacuated to the Philippines on the same ship, yes. It was called Hualien II, because it was the second Hualien going to the Philippines. The first one went with young, strong guys who helped build the camp because we all lived in tents. So they had to set everything up, and there were no facilities on the island of Tubabao. There was an old military storage base that was guarded by Philippine military, but we were put just, here's a jungle, you know, and our guys had to clear it and put up tents and dig toilets and etc. So,
you were 7 years old boy, yes, when you...
Not to the Philippines, no. I was already, that was 1949, I was born 38, so I was 11.
11.
But when I started being an altar boy in church, I was 7 years old. Yeah.
So what do you remember from your life in Philippines on Tubabao?
Well, Tubabao actually, for us kids, was, in my terminology, paradise, because we kids, there was no control. They had a school in a tent, and the minute the teacher turned towards the blackboard to teach us boys would run and go to, because you swim, you know, it's tropics. So, you know, wonderful swimming and all that, so we'd all run to the beach, play games. But what saved us were the Russian Boy Scouts. We had a 1,000 scout troop there. And so the scouts, I was what they call Volchonik, still, which is the smaller junior scouts. And I was in a Volchonik in Zvino, and I kept it up. Even when I went to Australia, I became a scout and was there in the Russian Scouts too. That same thing, and continued also being an altar boy in Australia, in the churches there.
But in general, was it difficult to live on Tubabao?
For the grown-ups, you know, when you're a child, and especially when you're among your own type people, you know, everybody was in the same situation. There was no money, you couldn't buy anything. I mean, the Filipinos would come by sometimes on a bicycle run, little chiliashka, little, I don't even know how to call it, a little homemade on wheels cart that on a bicycle drive up to, they used to make ice cream out of coconut, you know, and of course that was a big thing. But we really, and our parents didn't have any money because they were just doing work just about like in the army. Well, this has to be cleaned up, the women take turns cooking in a general kitchen to which the whole district would go. We had 13 districts in Tubabao. Now, I lived with my uncle and grandfather in the 6th district. My mother and stepfather lived in the 2nd district or 1st district, I don't remember. The musical and artist district was the 13th district. But we had, you know, so there was, but for children, it was all game. And the scouts kept us busy, you know. They actually had trying to teach us Russian history, teaching us everything, poetry, you name it, you know, and plus the different activities that scouts do, you know, how to distinguish plants, how to go you know, on marches, how to, so, but so for the children, wasn't bad. I was there for what, for 1 year basically. And then my aunt and uncle got a visa to go to Australia. And so my mother asked my uncle, who's her brother, to take me with him because there was really no serious school in the Philippines.
Did you, small boy, or your friends, did you all understand why you need to keep Orthodoxy, why you need to keep your Russian
Heritage.
roots, heritage? Yes.
You know, I do not believe any of us, especially as children, even thought about it. I mean, we accepted the circumstances it was. For a child, and I know I talked to my wife, and she was in a refugee camp in Trieste, you know, Italy, where they all lived, and they all lived in, well, not quite a barracks, but some like it. Also Russians. But they all had something in common with the kids in, you know, it's like growing up in, whether in Moscow or in San Francisco or here in DC, and you all live right in this neighborhood. Well, you become friends. Yeah, you have some people, your other kids you don't like, get into fights with, or they don't like you, but generally you all have about the same economic situation, which as children, of course, you don't realize. All you know is he's dressed like you or she's dressed like you, so you know each other, you get together, you have gatherings if your parents can, they make parties for you on your birthday or names day, whatever. So you kind of never, as a child, I never entered my mind that I could be anything else but Orthodox, or, you know, and the Russian, and my grandfather always regaled me with stories of the traditions of the Russian fleet and the Navy, and etc.
So you were grown on these stories of Russian heritage, yes,
Yes.
of Russian culture.
Yes, yes. Mostly from my grandfather. Remember, he was blind, but he had a great memory. He could, you know, talk about.
What did he tell you?
Oh, everything from the Battle of Tsushima and how he went through the cadet corps, how they had to climb up ships. And my dream was always to become also a naval officer. It didn't work out that way. But my dream, because my father also finished what they call accelerated courses right during the revolution, and became, in fact, in Russia they published a 36-tome study, and it's called Россия забытая и неизвестная, Russia Forgotten and Unknown. There are 36 tomes, and in one of them it's called Cadets and Junkers in the White Battle in Russia, in the counter-revolution. And my father is mentioned there because he commanded, I'm trying to think the English term, a katir, a small ship on the Kama River, you know, for the whites. And then he also escaped to China, Shanghai, and that's where he met my mother and married her, etc. So my grandfather told me stories about what it was like to be a cadet and etc. And so I always dreamed of following in those footsteps.
I mentioned that you sometimes you try to find English translations for Russian words. You are living here in the United States more than 50 years already. Does it mean that these 50 years, this period of time, didn't make you more American than Russian?
That's very difficult to say. See, first of all, I spent 33 of those years in the U.S. Army. Okay, I started out as an enlisted soldier, spent 12 years as a sergeant, then went to officer school, became an officer right around the Vietnam War time. served in Vietnam. I commanded an artillery battery in Vietnam. But then after that, and after going to a few military schools and etc., in our army here in the U.S., every officer has to have two specialties. Mm-hmm. My basic specialty was field artillery, what they call it. Mm-hmm. But my secondary was a specialist in Soviet military forces. Mm-hmm. So I spent so much time dealing with Russian. Mm-hmm. I was a liaison officer to the Soviet group of forces of occupation in East Germany, in Potsdam. Mm-hmm. I was an American liaison officer. So I dealt all the time with Soviets or Russian.
Which year?
From 74 to 77, mm-hmm. I was there. Mm-hmm. And then I came back here. I was assigned to the Pentagon, and then assigned to Fort Meade, and then I assigned San Francisco. But when I was assigned, other than the Pentagon, in the Pentagon I was a mess review officer for Chief Staff Army. But then when I assigned Fort Meade, I was interviewing Russian refugees. So I probably spoke more Russian than I did English at that time. And then after that, so the INF Treaty began, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. And I was one of the team chiefs going to Russia. So from 1988 until I retired in 92, I retired first time. That's all I did. I was in Russia all the time.
So you spent all this time in Russia? Yes?
Yeah, well, just about. I mean, we'd go in there, we'd fly to Japan, go to Russia for 48 hours, run the inspection, come out to Japan, then go back to Russia, and constantly working with Russians. And then I became one of the commanders in Votkinsk, where I'd be staying there for 6 weeks at a time, come out for 6 weeks and go back 6 weeks permanently, because that's where the production facility of the Russian SS-20s, 25s, 12s, 24s, excuse me, it was all there. So I spent all that time in Russia. And after that, I retired in 92, was recalled. I didn't even know the Army could do it, but I was a regular Army officer. I was a lieutenant colonel by that time, and they recalled me and assigned me to what's known and still exists, Task Force Russia in Moscow. Task Force Russia, we worked on finding or trying to find U.S. POW and missing in actions. Mm-hmm. And I lived permanently in Moscow. I rented an apartment and lived down there between Barrikadne and Krasnoprezhinskaya. Yes, right. I used to walk through the back gate of the embassy. But 90% of the time, I was on the road, on trains and planes all over Russia, interviewing people who claimed they saw American prisoners of war in gulags or whatever.
Were you successful in that job, that task?
Only in the Cold War shootdowns, where our planes had strayed over and were shot down. There were a whole number of them. Usually most of this occurred in 1952, 58. And I know we dug up or were looking for remains of a plane of people listed as missing in action from 1958 of a shoot down in Armenia, in Sushishan, a little town 60 kilometers from Yerevan. I spent a whole month out there with a crew where we were digging up, trying to find enough to do a DNA analysis. We didn't find enough because they accounted for seven people whose remains the Soviets handed back to us. Excuse me. But there were like 16 people on board the plane. So how about the rest of them? We never could find enough DNK or enough bone or nail, because you need something like that to do a proper DNA.
So you didn't find alive POW or even
not live, no. Dead, yes, we did one on Kuro Islands on Yuri Ostrov. We dug up the remains of a Navy lieutenant. His plane was shot down in 1952, and the only reason we found him because one of the border guards, he called himself, Pogranichnik, who lived in Donetsk, who was 90-some years old, wrote a letter to us at our embassy in Moscow saying, I feel bad, I stole the Annapolis ring from this officer. When the plane was shot down, his body floated up. He was a tall guy, about like you, 6'2" or something, you're even taller than that, and McDonough. And what's interesting...
McDonald, you mean airplane, yes?
What?
McDonald's.
No, that was his, no, McDonough was his last name, Lieutenant McDonough. And in fact, his daughter had just flown into Moscow wanting to know, I want to know what happened to my father. She was 2 years old when he was shot down. And so we had this letter, so we went to Primorsky Krai, the Primorsk region, because when we interviewed this individual, he showed us the ring, said, I want to give it back to a family member. I'm going to die soon, and I just feel guilty because I took the ring off the body of this. Anyway, so we were sent, a whole group. We have a military unit in Hawaii called CILHI. CILHI stands for Central Identification Laboratory Hawaii. And they do DNA, they usually a team of about 10 people. One is an anthropologist, one is a graves registration, which is a military term of people who deal with remains during war. They remain, they make sure they're properly prepared, shipped back to wherever. And the other 8 guys are just infantrymen, Pichotinцы, who can live in any circumstance they live in. And we were out there and it was very hot. I remember they were all getting burned. And I asked the Armenians, don't you have any oils we can buy there in Yerevan? Because everybody, we were getting burned. It was about this time of year, very hot. And they told, the Armenians told me, said, the problem with you guys, you wash too often. Don't wash so much. And you won't get burned. But anyway, that's kind of a side. But so I did that for about a year and a half. And then even after that, when you say how much time, how American I am, after that I came back. The Army finally released me, so I re-retired. But even then, the Undersecretary of Defense for Prisoners of War Missing in Action, which is a special position in the Pentagon, and he said, okay, I'll release you from military, but you got to stay as a civilian.
In this commission, yes?
Right, on this commission. And I did. I stayed for another, I don't know, 8 months or whatever, there, living in Moscow and traveling over the Soviet Union. And then, so when that finished, I came back, and U.S. oil company hired me to run oil production facility in Kiev, Ukraine. So, and I did that from 94 to 2000. I flew back and forth every 10 days. And I had a production facility. I had all Ukrainians, Russians, all former colonels in the Soviet Army working for me, and some women who were accountants, typists, stuff like that. And we brought in base oils from Lukoil and additives from France. And we would mix them there in Svitoshina, which is a big base on the edge of Kiev. I rented a great big area, and we had mixers that we'd mix, and I'd sell these oils. Ukrzheleznice was my big contract, and then Technical, for the
Which company you worked for?
It was called Petra Ltd. It's
Petra
small
PD?
company. LTD, limited,
Ltd.
Limited, LTD,
Ltd.
yeah. Petra.
As I see, U.S. military and that company used your Russian heritage very extensively.
Yes, yes. Yes, I spent, especially my later years in the military, was more to do with Russia or with the Soviet Union than anything.
Was it difficult? You spent 33 years in U.S. military. Was it difficult to be Russian there, to keep your Russian, let's say, traditions? Was it difficult to you?
Not really, because especially once I got into the Soviet area specialization, say as a liaison officer in Potsdam, you know, or actually we lived in Berlin and then traveled in Potsdam to East Germany. Because all the officers I worked with, we were not a big unit. We were a classified unit. It was very secret. Because basically we were разведчики. We were photographing Soviet equipment, observing. But it was an agreement with the Soviets. They had the same mission in Frankfurt. Okay, so, and the secret was from our own people. Because Soviets, we were in American uniforms. Well, I had a Soviet document that I was a formal, you know, officer связи or liaison officer to the Soviet forces. So I was accredited. We had a big license plate on our huge Fords, American flag with a huge number. So the Soviet side saw us all the time, knew us. In fact, they killed one of us in '85 there. Shot, he's buried here, Arthur Nicholson, he was a major, and was shot in Ludwigslust in East Germany. So they always chased us and would shoot at us and all that. But they weren't supposed to, because per agreement, and until Nicholson was shot, we never said anything our side. But when Nicholson shot, we went to the commander-in-chief of Soviet forces and said, look, we have an agreement. We don't shoot at your guys. Why are you shooting at us? We have an agreement. We can go travel anywhere in East Germany except restricted areas. So, you know, so there was the chiefs of staff met and etc. But all the officers I worked with, coming back to your question, they were also Soviet specialists. They studied like 5 years. They studied Russian language, history, and there was a school in Garmisch, Germany, that's still there today.
But they were Americans, yes?
They were Americans, yeah. Well, it depended. There was a lot of mixed, you know, something like me, parents were Ukrainian or something like that. And later on, when I was assigned to the on-site inspection agency, and there, out of 16 of us team chiefs, 3 of us were of Russian, Belarusian, or Ukrainian background. 2 were Air Force, and I was Army. You know, we grew up as in the family that spoke Russian as the first language. Even the one from Ukraine, Mostovoi Vitaly, he was a Lieutenant Colonel Air Force, and Mike Kritzik, who's now dead, he was a fighter pilot in Vietnam and etc. He was from Belarus, or his family, but they all spoke Russian as the first language. So, you know, it wasn't that, but to keep the traditions, you know, Russian traditions are so friendly and hospitable that when, say, my wife would have dinners and have other people, these guys loved it. And of course, when they were studying at the Soviet specialty school, which was Garmisch, Germany, where what used to be called Detachment R for Russia, and where they were supposed to speak Russian every day, and their wives were included, that look, you know, here's the traditions, here's how you do it. So it was nothing new to them. And so, you know, we probably, the hardest time I had for being Russian is when we had a couple officers whose relatives or brothers were, say, in the Vietnam War also and died there because were shot. And so they had a tendency to say, oh, these Russians, you know, they killed my brother, you know, and that. So they kind of had an aggressive, but they'd always turn to me and say, Nick, I don't mean you and Helen, you know, me and my wife, you know. But yeah, you have that, but that's natural, I think. And I never felt, it didn't impact my career, certainly. It didn't negate it, it didn't slow me down in terms of promotion.
What do you remember from Vietnam? What stories?
Well, there are no stories. I was a battery commander. I commanded an artillery battery. You know, war is war. You know, was there nothing? You live, you survive. My battery, in 6 months, we'd moved 22 times from one place to another. Helicopters that lift me up, and sometimes by ground. You know.
What was the most difficult during your service there in Vietnam?
Well, when you're a commander of a 160-man unit, you know, the most difficult thing is to get them to live peacefully among each other, because I had blacks in my unit, I had liberals in my unit, and I have southern whites in my unit. So usually there would be these little prejudices, or, you know, well, it's any group of people, and you live in a very small area, everybody's got his hooch, as we called it, you know, but mostly it was culverts we used piled up with sandbags because we'd get attacked by mortar fire and that too. So they slept in these culverts that are about a bit higher than this table, you know, and etc. The guns, artillery is a lot of heavy physical work because you have to build blast walls. We'd always have 200 rounds of 155 millimeter ammunition that came 2 rounds per box. Each round weighed 75 pounds. So you're talking a lot of, you know, physical work, and even when you're loading the cannon and when you have a fire mission, and we'd fire, and or you have even at night when you have illumination missions, you're supporting the infantry or the armor or wherever they're fighting. And so it's constant physical work. And then when you move, you've got these thousands of sandbags you have to fill to protect both the men and the equipment and that. You have to build blast walls. Vietnam, because it has wet season and dry season, the wet season we're told artillery, so you have what's called outriggers. I mean, the cannon weighs 15 tons, you know, and it takes 20 men and a boy, you know, to lift the thing and move it. And yet we have to be able to fire 24, 360 degrees, anywhere, have to move it fast when a fire mission was requested. You know.
Were you able to keep your Orthodox traditions during this service, these years in Vietnam?
I can't say Orthodox tradition, but we had a chaplain, Capellan, come to us, Father David. He was a chaplain in the Navy. He's a retired Navy chaplain, yes. But we had chaplains in the Army that would come and serve. Now, during my year in Vietnam, which was 70-71, I didn't have a single Orthodox that came to my battery position where I was, but I had either Catholic or Jewish or Protestant or, you know, the different religions come. And what's interesting, the American soldiers, they would all go, virtually the whole battery would go to attend the service, no matter who did. And even the Jewish rabbi, when he would come, which was, I don't know, maybe twice in the year that a Jewish rabbi was sent to my battery position, you know, he would conduct, a special little service for those that were of Jewish faith, but then he would conduct a Christian service for the others.
Mm-hmm. So I think it wasn't it wasn't so important in that circumstances. Who came? Jewish rabbin?
No.
Catholic priest?
No, no. In battle, it doesn't matter. People who need that spiritual, you might say, connection with somebody that they see as a representative of the Lord, and that, it didn't seem to matter. At least I didn't notice that nobody griped saying so and so.
So did these people, rabbis, priests from other denominations understood that there are people of all different faiths,
yeah,
and they need something special. Yes,
I think they did, because first of all, they all go through training. Other than their religious training, they go in the army, the Chaplain Corps. It's a branch, Rotvoisk, and they just you're better off asking Father David, who's serving the Navy. Now I don't know if he should have during Vietnam, if he was there, he might have been sent to units, because the Navy had what they call Seabees. They're naval engineers, but they build bridges, they build roads. They would come even to where I was in the mountains to, say, build the revetments for my guns, etc. So he might have been sent. He could probably tell you more. But they have a training, just like I had artillery training when the Army said you're going to be an artillery officer. You go through the basic 3 months and then later on a year, because there are a lot of complicated methods you use and computations and etc. Well, the Chaplain Corps has their own training. That's probably 3 to 6 months for a beginning chaplain. Okay, he finished a seminary somewhere. He was ordained a priest, but then he had, and here's what's particular about being a military chaplain, because in the United States, I know my son was born at Fort Carson, Colorado, for instance. We were stationed there. Well, we had 3 or 4 churches right on the base by denomination. We would have a Protestant, a Catholic, definitely, but we also might have Methodist and a Baptist, and etc. Now, some bases, they don't, because they're in a, say, close to a large city like, say, Denver, Colorado, or San Francisco, like Presidio didn't have, though they had, even then they had 2 chapels in Presidio, San Francisco. Washington, D.C., there's a base here. Well, in fact, the headquarters of the Chaplain Corps for the Air Force is at Bowling Air Force Base. I don't know if you know, you know Bowling. Well, that's their headquarters of the Air Force chaplain, and that's where they go to school, and they go and they teach them. Here's how you should deal. Here's what happens when you go to some remote Air Force base. You're going to have these different denominations, and you got to be able to handle it. Because many of the especially basic soldiers, not officers, but the mostly simple soldiers, that today there's no such thing, because we have a volunteer army, and you have to have very high technical knowledge to even just be enlisted, So, but even then, they usually like to go to a chaplain if he has problems in marriage, or if he has problems with debts or something. They trust the chaplain more than, say, coming to a commander. So that's what the Chaplain Corps is there for. So they get trained how to handle. It doesn't matter what denomination that soldier is.
Did you have situations in your life when, as you're feeling, God saved you, or God helped you? If you can share, of course.
Yeah, I don't. I'll put it this way. My wife has had 3 bouts with cancer. Okay, so when she had her procedures or whatever, I would always pray And after that, I'd always thank God. I always feel that maybe my prayer helped. Okay? I was just treated with cancer, right? 39 radiation treatments here at Walter Reed. I'm still getting some shots still for my cancer. And again, I prayed, and I think I'm cured now, and I thank every time I come to church. I do thank him, yes.
Did these difficult situations help you to keep your faith?
I don't know. I'm a bit of a skeptic when it comes to faith, because especially being military, what I've seen man do to other men, so cruel. I can't help but sometimes wonder, well, if I was God, would I allow that? So I have those kind of questions in there, but basically no. I've been brought up in the faith, and that's why it's called faith. It's there's no scientific explanation you can give. Some people try. I notice, and when I read sometimes some young seminarian who writes some book and try to prove that, well, the sun goes up and the moon goes up just because of God. I think it's a silly thing to do. Don't try to give scientific explanations to phenomena. But no, I don't.
You have two children, a son and daughter.
And a daughter, that's right. But they're not children. They're both 50 years, over 50 years old, yeah.
Are they more Russians, or are they...
My daughter is, because she's very religious. In fact, she taught, there's a young lady sings in our choir here, who's a daughter of a priest in San Francisco, Father Sergei. He was here a few weeks ago. He came visiting. He came visiting because he was blessing their house. She's married to a U.S. Marine who comes to the English language service, and she sings in the choir. My daughter taught her to sing. My daughter was a regentsha in Tikhonozadonsky in San Francisco. And today, because she works for the city of San Francisco, but her job is in Moccasin, which is close to Yosemite, she found 4 Orthodox churches out there in the middle of nowhere. There's the second oldest Serbian Orthodox church out there in Sonora. She goes, it's an OCA church, but she goes there, and there's a Spanish language priest, well, of Spanish background priest there, and she leads the choir there. And then there are 2 other, there's a monastery there, and some now it's Orthodox. So.
But son is more American, right?
Son is American, yes. But when he got married, he's got an American wife, and we have a grandson who is named in honor of my father, Arkady, his name is, and my wife is very upset, I am too, that he never brings him to church, but his wife is against it. But she agreed that he be Christianed as an Orthodox, and he was. In fact, Father Alexander christianed him. But, we think it's a shame, but, it's usually more, I find, at least in Russian families, it's usually the woman who really takes kids to church and that. I mean, there's some exceptions, some fathers do. But if the woman doesn't back it, it's harder.
Can you share your experience? How did you give your heritage, your Russian roots, your Russian heritage, your Orthodoxy to your children?
Well, quite frankly, because I was in the military and traveling all over and different assignments, it was more my wife that did that.
But how did she do that?
Well, because when we got married, we were in San Francisco, and with the church, there's a Russian school, etc. And they would go there, and we'd take them. And my son was an altar boy too, and he was also, both my son and daughter were in the Russian Scouts, and they're always tied very closely to the church. So they attended the school. There, and then, but once I got assigned to Germany, but even in Germany, in Berlin, there was a Russian Orthodox cathedral. And what's interesting, the Soviet forces from Potsdam would drive the Archbishop, who was with the Soviet forces, to Berlin, who would serve in that cathedral there, and it was right in the center of Berlin, beautiful Russian Orthodox cathedral. And then when I'd be duty officer in Potsdam, and I used to volunteer to pull duty, one of us officers we have a representative house in Potsdam in East Germany, or had, and an officer had to be there 24 hours a day, always, because it was like just like an embassy type, because it represented the United States. I would volunteer to be on duty during American Christmas, because we celebrate Russian Christmas, which is seldom on the same day as American Christmas. So my family and I'd go, but we would come, and there was a church in Potsdam itself. And mind you, Potsdam was like some of the main Soviet forces. There was the 34th Gun Artillery Division there, Soviet. 10th Guards Army Division, 12th Guards Tank Division. They were all right in Potsdam, around. There were probably 5-6 units, because it surrounded Berlin, Soviet divisions. And they had an Orthodox church that's from 1700 something, up on a hill there in Potsdam. And my wife and I would go there. Of course, in uniform. I had to be always in the American uniform. And we took our kids there. So even there, when we were overseas or in places, the hardest place was probably where my son was born, in Fort Carson, Colorado. There was the nearest church was at the Air Force Academy, which was close in Colorado Springs. And once a month, an Orthodox priest, a colonel, Air Force colonel, something like Father David here, who would fly in to or drive from Denver to the Air Force Academy and have a service. They have a non-denominational chaplain, and all us Orthodox were there. In fact, I'm sure you've heard the last name Radzianko. Well, Misha Radzianko was an Air Force officer. We served together. And he was a cadet at the Air Force Academy when I was a lieutenant in the Army. And so that's where we first met. There was him and his brother. They were both at the Air Force Academy as cadets. And later on he became a fighter pilot, fought in Vietnam, and he worked with me with the on-site inspection agency. We were together. He was also a team chief. So I lied. I said there were 4 of us of Russian or Ukrainian, Belarusian extraction.
When you come to the church now, in your age, in these circumstances, what are you looking for now, here? What are you seeking?
I'm not. I think it's just, the tradition. If I don't go to church, I feel I miss something. It's just for basically, you might say, I'll be 81 here in August. For 81 years, I've been going to Orthodox church. I mean, some years I couldn't because there was no church like in Vietnam or that, or at Fort Carson, Colorado. But basically, for 81 years, I think, it'd be just like not waking up or getting up.
And what Orthodoxy means for you? What does it mean for you being Orthodox, Russian Orthodox?
I don't think I can explain, how, in what way does it mean. When I was in Australia, and I was in Australia from time I was I guess 12, 13, 14, yeah, 11 in fact, to 14. I went to a Church of England school, private school, and it was mandatory. Every morning we started with prayers in the chapel. So, you know, I would go there, and frankly, when I look at most Christian religions, they're very similar. When you talk about Orthodox, what to me it means is, you know, just our service, our choral singing, things that I've gotten used to and I like very much. Actually, here in Washington, D.C., is the first time I really heard the English version of the Orthodox service, because I always used to go to Russian. Here we come to the early service just so we don't spend the whole day, because when you come to Russian service, we don't get out of here till 2, 3 in the afternoon. And especially in the summer, because we expect our grandson come visit us. Maybe we have a swimming pool at home, so he comes to swim, so it gives us a chance to spend some time with him. But once fall comes and winter, we go to the late service and then Russian, and I love our Russian choral singing, and that to me is the key difference between even fellow Orthodox services, say in a Serbian church or a Greek church, or
Thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Quite welcome, Dmitry.
Yes, thank you.